In 1492, Christopher Columbus made a mistake that shaped 5 centuries of history. He called the people he encountered Indians, believing he had reached Asia. He was wrong. But here is the twist. Modern genetics has revealed something that makes that old mistake far more complicated than anyone expected. Because buried deep inside the DNA of some indigenous American populations lies a signal that scientists themselves called a ghost. Not aliens, not Atlantis, not conspiracy. A genetic ghost. A trace of ancestry that appears to connect certain Amazonian indigenous groups to populations thousands of miles away in Australasia, including regions near Australia and New Guinea. That shouldn't be there. Or at least, it shouldn't be there according to the simple story most of us learned in school. The clean version says this: people crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into Alaska around 20,000 to 23,000 years ago. They moved south. They spread. They became the diverse indigenous civilizations of the Americas. That model is not wrong, but it is incomplete. And what scientists uncovered over the last decade forces us to rethink just how complex the peopling of the Americas really was. If you care about American ancestry, genetic history, and the real story behind human migration, subscribe now. This channel does not flatten history. We examine it where it's messy. Now let's decode the ghost. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, sea levels dropped dramatically. Vast quantities of water were locked in ice sheets. Between Siberia and Alaska, a landmass emerged, Beringia. For decades, textbooks taught a straightforward version of events. A single population crossed Beringia. They walked through an inland ice-free corridor. They spread south. End of story. But by the early 2000s, cracks appeared in that narrative. Archaeological sites like Monteverde in Chile showed human presence at least 14,500 years ago, possibly earlier. That timeline did not match the opening of the inland corridor, which likely became passable later. Genetics began pointing in a different direction. Instead of a simple inland march, many researchers now support a coastal migration model. Early peoples may have moved south along the Pacific coastline, navigating between glaciers and shoreline in boats or along ice edges. From the very beginning, the peopling of the Americas appears to have involved maritime capability, adaptability, and rapid expansion. By around 13,000 years ago, the Clovis culture appeared across North America. But even Clovis is no longer considered the beginning. It was part of a larger and older movement. So far, this is not controversial. Here is where it becomes interesting. When geneticists sequenced ancient remains and modern indigenous DNA at higher resolution, they began detecting signals that did not fit neatly inside a single migration wave. And one of those signals was astonishing. In 2015, geneticist David Reich and his colleagues published a study in the journal Nature. The paper analyzed genome-wide data from indigenous populations across the Americas. The team found something unexpected. In several indigenous groups in the Amazon, including the Surui and Caritiana, there was a small but statistically significant genetic affinity to present-day populations from Australasia. That includes people from regions near Australia, New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands. The proportion was small, roughly 1 to 3%. But it was consistent. It could not be explained by recent colonial contact. It was not noise. The researchers named this mysterious ancestral component Population Y, derived from a Tupi word meaning ancestor. And that label stuck. Ghost ancestor. Population Y. A genetic echo from the other side of the world. If you're still here, hit like. Because this is where most people stop listening and jump to wild conclusions. We're not going to do that. We're going to stay with the evidence. It does not mean ancient Australians sailed directly to Brazil. It does not mean indigenous Americans are secretly from Australia. It does not mean the Bering migration didn't happen. It does not mean a conspiracy. What it means is more subtle and more fascinating. The Australasian-related signal may reflect deep ancestral structure in Northeast Asia before the migration into the Americas. Human populations in Asia were not uniform 25,000 years ago. There was already diversity. Some groups carried genetic components that were more closely related to ancient Australasian-linked populations. If a small subgroup carrying that ancestry joined the migration into the Americas, their genetic signal could have persisted in certain descendant populations, especially if those groups remained relatively isolated. In other words, the ghost may not be from across the Pacific Ocean. It may be from deep time. That interpretation is currently favored by many geneticists. But here's the controversial part. The signal appears strongest in parts of South America, and largely absent in sampled North American populations. Why? That is still debated. If population Y ancestry entered through Beringia, you might expect to see it distributed across the migration path. Instead, it appears concentrated in certain Amazonian groups. One explanation is genetic drift. Small populations can amplify or lose signals unpredictably over thousands of years. Another explanation is that the early population structure within the Americas was more fragmented than previously believed. Subgroups may have separated early, with some carrying slightly different ancestral mixtures. Ancient DNA preservation is uneven. Tropical environments like the Amazon degrade DNA rapidly. That limits what we can recover from older remains. Sampling gaps matter. Not all communities participate in genetic research, often for very good historical reasons. So what looks like absence in North America may reflect incomplete data rather than biological reality. This is not a scandal. It is the frontier of science. Before population Y, another controversy dominated discussion. Kennewick Man. Discovered in 1996 in Washington state, the skeleton initially appeared morphologically different from modern Native Americans. Some claimed he resembled Polynesian or European populations. Speculation exploded. Then in 2015, genome sequencing resolved the question. Kennewick Man's DNA showed clear genetic continuity with modern Native American populations. The early different race theory collapsed under genetic evidence. This episode is important because it demonstrates something critical. Morphology can mislead. DNA clarifies. And DNA also complicates. Modern genomic research supports several migration events into the Arctic after the initial founding population. Roughly 5,000 years ago, ancestors of modern Inuit and Yupik peoples migrated from Siberia into North America. These groups carried distinct genetic signatures. That is well established. But crucially, all Indigenous American populations derive the overwhelming majority of their ancestry from a founding population connected to Northeast Asia. Population Y represents a minor ancestral contribution, not an alternative origin story. This distinction matters, because viral content loves to blur it. We are not rewriting Indigenous origins. We are refining them. There is another dimension to this story, and it is not scientific. It is ethical. Indigenous communities have long been studied, sampled, and published about without full participation or benefit. Dr. Kim Tallbear and other Indigenous scholars have raised important concerns about how genetic narratives intersect with sovereignty, identity, and political power. DNA can illuminate deep ancestry, but it does not define tribal citizenship. Tribal identity is cultural, legal, and communal, not a percentage on a consumer test. This is a critical point. Genetic complexity does not weaken Indigenous identity. It demonstrates deep antiquity and adaptability, and that is far more powerful. Indigenous Americans adapted to environments ranging from Arctic tundra to Andean highlands to Amazon rainforest. In the Andes, high-altitude adaptations altered oxygen regulation. In Arctic regions, metabolic pathways adapted to extreme cold and high-fat diets. In tropical zones, immune adaptations evolved in response to pathogens. This is not accidental. This is evidence of thousands of years of presence and innovation. Population Y does not disrupt that continuity. It enriches it. Because the signal was unexpected. Because it did not fit the simplest model. Because it hints at ancestral diversity that predates the Americas themselves. But ghosts are not conspiracies. They are reminders that history is rarely linear. The ghost ancestor of Indigenous Americans is not a scandal. It is a fragment of deep human migration, and it tells us something profound. The people who entered the Americas were already diverse, already complex, already part of a wider human story. The real controversy is not that Indigenous Americans have unexpected ancestry. The real controversy is how often the public wants simple origin stories. Humans prefer clean beginnings. One migration, one people, one narrative. Genetics resists that simplicity. It shows layers, population splits, bottlenecks, drift, intersections, and sometimes traces of lineages that almost vanished. That is not destabilizing. That is awe-inspiring. New sequencing technologies can extract DNA from older and more degraded samples than ever before. As more indigenous communities choose to collaborate in research partnerships built on consent and shared authority, the map will become clearer. We may discover additional ancestral components. We may refine timelines. We may uncover new migration corridors. But one conclusion is already firm. The peopling of the Americas was dynamic, rapid, and far more intricate than once believed. And Indigenous Americans remain the direct descendants of those ancient pioneers. If you have Indigenous ancestry, your DNA may contain layers of ancient structure that reflect migrations tens of thousands of years old. If you don't, your own ancestry likely contains ghost signals from deep population splits in Eurasia or Africa. We all carry ghosts. That is what makes us human. Before you leave, subscribe for more deep dives into American ancestry and genetic history. Share this video with someone who thinks the peopling of the Americas is a settled and simple story. It isn't, and that's the point. History is not rewritten by conspiracy. It is rewritten by evidence. And sometimes the evidence whispers, sometimes it surprises, and sometimes it leaves us staring at a ghost. The ghost ancestor of Indigenous Americans is not a threat to identity. It is a testament to survival. And the story is still unfolding. Stay curious, stay critical, and stay subscribed.